let me introduce you to our president, Norma Leavitt.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Norma Levy, and I'm president of New Plaza Cinema. Today, we're looking forward to a lively discussion about the 1960 film, The Apartment. I'm pleased to introduce our host, author, and film historian, Max Alvarez, who will lead the discussion. Max?
Thank you so much, Norma, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this online edition in which we discuss Billy Wilder's masterpiece from 1960 with our very special guest, Joseph McBride, who will be joining us in just a little while. Gary Palmucci, who normally is part of these discussions, is very busy overseeing our West End cinema right now. He's been doing a fabulous job there, but I know he's a huge fan of The Apartment, which was first released in the United States to cinemas on June 15th, 1960. Technically, that will be the final year of the artistically rich decade of the 1950s. This is producer-director Billy Wilder at the height of his powers. In addition to winning an Academy Award for Best Picture, The Apartment also won for director. The original screenplay by Wilder and his brilliant co-partner, I.A.L. Diamond, the black and white art direction of Alexander Trauner, and the editing of Daniel Mandel. The film remains one of Wilder's greatest achievements and one of Hollywood's enduring masterworks in its satirical skewering of corporate America and the 1950s rat race. Seldom has a motion picture walked a fine line between hilarity and tragedy as effortlessly as this one, where insurance company bean counter C.C. Baxter makes his Manhattan walk-up pad available to philandering executives who promise him career advancement. From the soullessness of corporate life to the sleazy excesses of executive privilege, The Apartment still resonates with audiences today, clearly from all over the world. We have a very impressive list of attendees from throughout the United States and the world. And we're thrilled that our New Plaza Cinema Talkback on this film will feature historian and prolific author Joseph McBride, who recently published an outstanding critical study on director Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge. We'll talk more about that. But let's begin with the original theatrical trailer for the film from distributor United Artists. If Gary were here, I suspect he would agree with me that this trailer looks as though it was thrown together in about 10 minutes by the UA sales staff. It's a pity we really don't get a sense of the film's brilliance from this rather uninspired selection of clips and narration. But hey, it worked in 1960, people went to see it, and it became a tremendous hit. Here's the original trailer.
Ingredient number one, a very warm, very wonderful story about a boy, a girl, and a very special kind of problem.
Did you hear what I said, Miss Kubelik? I absolutely adore you.
Shut up and deal.
Ingredient number two, a brilliant cast. Jack Lemmon in a delightful role which gives full rein to Jack's amazing versatility. Shirley MacLaine, whose glowing warmth lights up the screen like a Christmas tree. Fred MacMurray. This is a Fred MacMurray you've never seen before.
You know, you see a girl a couple of times a week just for laughs, and right away they think you're going to divorce your wife. I ask you, is that fair?
No, sir, it's very unfair, especially to your wife.
Yeah.
Ingredient number three, Billy Wilder. There's nothing quite like that Billy Wilder, some like it hot kind of laughter.
Are we dressing for dinner?
You know, just come as you are.
Say, you're pretty good with that racket.
You should see my backhand. Where did you see me serve the meatballs?
Mildred, he's at it again.
Now, in fairness to the UA sales staff, while the trailer was a little uninspired, the original poster for the apartment, I think, is pretty good. I mean, it's not the greatest artwork, but I like the copy for the original poster. Movie-wise, there has never been anything like the apartment. Love-wise, laugh-wise, or otherwise-wise. Clearly, the person who wrote that copy had seen the film because it's a play on the corporate jargon that Jack Lemmon and other executives use in the insurance company offices. So that's how the apartment was originally sold in 1960. Now, since Dan Cahill, our expert on cinematography, can't join us, well, I think he's out there in the audience, but he's not going to be one of the presenters today. I'm going to be giving a brief overview of just some of the memorable look to the apartment. I'm going to take us through some of the very powerful, I can just, I was warned about there we go. We're going to take a look at the visual look, some of the scenes that really stand out from Billy Wilder's masterpiece. And the appropriate place to begin is what I call Corporate Sterility 1959, which the film captures very, very effectively from, of course, the New York office building where C.C. Baxter and company work, to the extraordinary office of the insurance company, which looks like the real deal, but which is in fact a set brilliantly designed by Alexander Trauner at the Samuel Goldwyn studio in West Hollywood, complete with neon lights or fluorescent lights overhead, and a very depressing, almost Kafkaesque corporate sterility. This is at the very beginning of the film. Jack Lemmon memorably introduced at his office machine, which has a life of its own. And then there's a very inspired dissolve as his co-workers are getting ready to leave for the evening, covering up their machines and packing their belongings. We dissolve to C.C. Baxter remaining at his desk, not so much out of loyalty to his job, but because his apartment is in use. This look at the corporate sterility of the 59 continues as some of the executives who rely on C.C. Baxter's apartment are seen in their glass offices. The objective for C.C. Baxter, where you see Trauner's amazing fluorescent lights and desks through the glass. And even this lobby sequence, the elevator bank, where men and some women are lined up under the fluorescents, all part of Trauner's brilliant set design. When C.C. Baxter gets his promotion, the camera, I believe this is a tracking shot of him carrying his Rolodex and his paperwork to what will be his new glass office. It's a triumphant moment for C.C. Baxter, but it's offset at the Christmas party where he takes a very depressed stroll back through the empty office as the party goes on behind him. This is after he learns that Fran, the woman he has a crush on, has been to his apartment with his boss, Sheldrake. The apartment was one of many Billy Wilder pictures that were photographed in Panavision, and we have some examples of, and by the way, if your videos are on right now, if you could turn them off, it will help us in terms of getting the right quality for you, and also mute yourselves. The Panavision frame here is used very, very expertly. As we see the stairwell, we see C.C. Baxter, we see Mrs. Dreyfus neatly laid up across the screen. We see the Ray Walston character in the bar with a woman he's planning to bring home with him, expertly laid out in the Panavision format, which Wilder will use throughout the 1960s. There's a power struggle going on here. C.C. Baxter has his glass office, but the men responsible, well, they clearly still have the power here, and they're not about to let him forget about it. Margie McDougal, we're going to talk more about Hope Holiday later, but that depressing Christmas Eve in the bar, they are perfectly placed in the Panavision widescreen frame here as they're staring ahead, not entirely sober, pondering their depressing lives. When Sheldrake brings Fran to the apartment, we see them on opposite sides of the screen. He's has his power by standing over her as she is very, very distraught. After she's attempted suicide, I love how she's laid out on the bed there, taking advantage of the widescreen cinema Panavision frame, as Baxter is unaware of the seriousness of her condition. Then afterwards, they're playing cards at opposite ends of the screen. And then when her brother enters the picture, we have the men in the glass office laid out with Ray Walston putting his feet on his desk. And then the Fran's brother showing up at the apartment shortly before he takes a slug at C.C. Baxter. When we see Baxter in his new office working for Sheldrake still is in a position of power, sitting behind his desk. And then the hollow victory of C.C. Baxter's new office, which this is what he's fought for. And you have to, and the desolation here, the way this is presented to us suggests that it's a very hollow victory for C.C. Baxter. And then the culminating scene between Fran and C.C. My favorite use of a prop in film history, I think, is the compact that C.C. finds in his apartment and he gives to Sheldrake. The compact is broken, and during the Christmas party, he realizes the compact belongs to Fran. And just the use of that prop is just so powerful. And then the film captures the desolate side of C.C. Baxter, the loneliness of C.C. Baxter in his apartment with his TV dinner. We have somebody's audio is still on, if you could maybe mute yourself. And then we have him on the park bench at night because he's unable to go to his apartment, waiting for Fran outside the Majestic, C.C. Baxter's isolation. And finally, the very powerful face of Shirley MacLaine's Fran in the Chinese restaurant early on, when she thinks Jeff Sheldrake might actually leave his wife for her. When she finds out she's just along in a list of women he's had affairs with at work. This is when she's in Baxter's new glass office. When she realizes at the apartment that she's just been used by him and that there's no future for them. After she's attempted suicide, she's more philosophical, melancholy, but seemingly accepting of her fate. And then finally, when she realizes that Baxter will not allow his apartment to be used if Sheldrake brings her to it. A very powerful close-up of Shirley MacLaine, which is topped only by the tracking shot as she's running towards the apartment at the very end of the film. So these are just some of the very, very memorable moments from Billy Wilder's picture. But now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our special guest, Joseph McBride. He's a film historian and a professor in the School of Cinema at San Francisco State University. He's published 24 books, most recently, the critical study, The Whole Darn Human Comedy, Life According to the Coen Brothers, which we saw a cover of. Laurie had mentioned there's an updated version of his amazing Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, A Portrait of an Independent Career, which I can't wait to see the revised version of that. The Political Truth, the Media, and the Assassination of President Kennedy, and of course, his brilliant critical study, Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge, which came out in October from Columbia University Press. And he's also written a fantastic book on Ernst Lubitsch, How Did Lubitsch Do It? He's also written biographies of Frank Capra, Steven Spielberg, and John Ford. And if you haven't seen the Orson Welles film, The Other Side of the Wind on Netflix, it's only available on Netflix. It's the long in making film that finally came out in 2018. That's Joseph McBride playing the gadfly film critic and historian, Mr. Pister, who is constantly pestering John Huston's Jake Hannaford with inane, pretentious questions. That's Joseph McBride. He's received Emmy and Writers Guild of America awards nominations for his writing of American Film Institute Life Achievement Award tributes to Fred Astaire, Lillian Gish, John Huston. And if that isn't enough, he's also done audio commentaries for 8 Billy Wilder films, most recently the Kino Lorber releases of The Apartment and Some Like It Hot. Needless to say, Joseph McBride, we are honored to have you with us today at New Plaza Cinema.
Great to be here, Max. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with everybody from all around the world. That's fantastic. The range of our reach here.
Well, before we get to the apartment, a little backgrounder in your interest in Billy Wilder. You actually, I presumably you met him on several occasions. Could you give us some idea of how your interest in Wilder started?
Yeah, this is a picture of me behind us of me talking with him in 1995. I gave him the Career Achievement Award from the LA Film Critics Association, and I was first aware of him. Actually, the first film I saw twice in a theater was Wilder's 1957 film, The Spirit of St. Louis, the very anomalous film that he did about Charles Lindbergh with Jimmy Stewart, and I was so impressed I went back to see it. But Some Like It Hot was a big event for me as a kid. I was a very repressed Catholic kid, and could you imagine going to see Some Like It Hot in 1959 when I was 11, I guess, and seeing cross-dressing and Marilyn Monroe, who I had a big crush on, as everybody did, and she was very sexy, but very vulnerable, very three-dimensional, very great film. Had a huge impact on me. I missed The Apartment when it came out for some reason, but a film that had a big influence on me was Irma la Douce, which Wilder made in 1963. That was his most popular film, and it also stars Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine. It's about prostitution, as is The Apartment in its way. But Irma la Douce is kind of a lighthearted romp in Paris, very beautiful pastel colors. Alexander Troner, that was Wilder's most popular film. And I was a student in a Catholic high school in Milwaukee, and I went to see it, and I was so scandalized that I left in the middle. I thought this is, you know, I was fascinated but scandalized. And then I went back to see it again, and I made it almost to the end, but when she has the baby in the church at the end, I walked out again. I just thought I shouldn't be there. And I went back a third time, and I finally made it all the way through, which I thought was the landmark in my sex education. So Billy Wilder was my sex education teacher. And I think he helped raise the sophistication level of the whole American audience, which was struggling to get out of our puritanical heritage. And it just, it kind of helped free me. And the Legion of Decency condemned some of his films. And when I was still a Catholic kid, every year we had to stand up in church and pledge we wouldn't see any condemned films. And in 1965, I came back from college at the University of Wisconsin and refused to stand for the pledge. And my father was very angry at me. And that was my first overt break with the church. And I think a lot of that was inspired by Irma la Douce and Some Like It Hot. So thank you, Mr. Wilder. And then I began writing about him 52 years ago. Michael Wilmington, who died recently, and I were writing partners, and we wrote a piece for Film Quarterly called The Private Life of Billy Wilder, which was a career overview. This is 52 years ago. And, I've evolved in my thinking about him somewhat, but it still holds up pretty well. And then we reviewed Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which was slighted by the American audience and reviewers because Wilder, in response to the freeing of the American screen with sex and language and violence, he became more conservative. Conservative is not the right word. He became more romantic. I think he was always a kind of a closeted romantic, a secret romantic. I.L. Diamond, his writing partner, called him a disappointed romantic. But I call Wilder the bull in the china shop of American Puritanism in the 50s. But he was breaking all the crockery, but by the 60s, all the crockery was broken. So what was he going to do? He turned more romantic. He made Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which is a beautiful film, and we gave it a good review. And I reviewed Avanti in 1972, which is, I think, my favorite Wilder film. Very romantic film. He tried to do Lubitsch types of films throughout his career and never quite succeeded until Avanti. And I wrote a review called The Importance of Being Ernst for film Heritage, I guess it was. And and then in 1974, I moved to California in 73, and I went on the set of The Front Page, his newspaper film based on the Ben Heck, Charles MacArthur play. And I interviewed Wilder, and I spent a day watching him shoot, which was invaluable. And he was very approachable, and old newspaper guys like me and Wilder, I mean, I started in 1960 and he started in 24 as a newspaper guy before he became a filmmaker. We kind of recognize each other and can talk right away. I had the same rapport with Sam Fuller. So I got along with him. He was very quotable, very a brilliant guy to talk to. And I interviewed Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau and other people involved in the film. And so over the years, I interviewed Wilder a number of times and did a long interview with him in 1978 with Todd McCarthy for Film Comment. And I had it in the back of my mind to write a book about him for many years, and I finally got around to it. And I was going to write a book on Wilder and Lubitsch together. I thought that was a clever idea. And I spent about a year doing that around 2010. And then I realized they're as different as they are similar. You know, they have Lubitsch was Wilder's mentor, but I was teaching a course on them at San Francisco State, and I realized how different they are in substantial ways. So I broke off the Wilder part, and I thought, well, I'll write a whole book on him. And I got back to it after the Lubitsch book. And also, his career was huge. I mean, I write about his journalism, and then I write about his German filmmaking, which most people don't know much about, and his early Hollywood screenplays, which are pretty well ignored. And I wrote about those, and then all the films he directed in America. So it's a long, complex book, but you know, at this point in my career, I pick books that are fun to do. And what could be more fun than studying Ernst Lubitsch and Billy Wilder?
Absolutely, and and the book, and as you pointed this out yourself, but it's not a biography. It is a critical study. You're examining his life and his films, but it's not a then he did this, then he did that type of thing. And it is fascinating that you were able to. I believe you actually had to go to Germany to see some of the early films he wrote as a screenwriter before fleeing in 1933 because they're not available.
Yeah, I went to Germany twice to see Lubitsch films because they were hard to see in America. More and more of them are filtering in, but still some of them have never been released in America. So I went there, and I went to Switzerland. And then in that research, I also studied Wilder because he spent several years in Berlin. And for example, to see his first film credited film, Teufel's Reporter, which was The Devil's Reporter. I had to see that at the National Archive in Berlin. And also I watched Fanfares of Love, which is a 1953 film that was what Some Like It Hot was a remake of that film. And then you really can't see that except going to Berlin. So, you know, it's very important. Goethe, the German poet, said, to understand a poet, you must go unto the poet's land. So I did that with Lubitsch and Wilder, and it's very important. I do that with other people. Spielberg, he lived in 5 cities growing up, so I did it 5 times over. Wilder was in exile several times over. He was born in what is now Poland, and he and his family moved to Krakow first, and his the parents, they had a hotel, and then they moved to Vienna. And he spent his formative years, I guess you'd call them his adolescent years in Vienna, and he became a journalist there. And then he moved to Berlin in 1926, and then he had to leave because of Hitler. He went to Paris for a year. He co-directed a film there called Mauvais Grand. And then he came to America. And then I think in the last 21 years of his life, I say he was in internal exile in the United States. He wasn't allowed to make a film in Hollywood after 1981. He lived till 2022. And when I gave my speech about him in 1995, I was really vehement about how Hollywood had turned its back on this great filmmaker. I remember one time I was in the Universal Commissary talking to a producer who was interested in my work, and she said, I can't get anybody to direct a romantic comedy today. Nobody knows how to direct a romantic comedy. And I said, well, what about Billy Wilder? You know, and she looked at me, Billy Wilder, she said, he's not bankable. And that kind of shows you the stupid attitude people had toward him. And What a shame, neglecting this great filmmaker. And part of what drives me to write a book is feeling that some subject or person has been neglected or um, done an injustice to. And Wilder has had many great honors. He won 3 Oscars for The Apartment. He was the first person who got Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Screenwriter with I.L. Diamond all at once. 7 other people have done it since, but he was at the pinnacle in terms of his prestige in 1960. And then gradually he began losing his audience, but made some of his best films. And I felt his later films have been unfairly slighted and neglected, and a lot of people haven't even seen some of them. And then his earlier films were misunderstood to some extent. And I try to question and criticize the simplistic attitude that he was simply a cynic. I don't think he was.
Yeah.
I call him a disappointed romantic, as as Diamond put it. And then also the idea that he was a misogynist, I think doesn't hold water. There are many good women in his films, people who he really admires, such as Shirley MacLaine, even though she's a flawed human being. And Molly Haskell, who's written some great work on women in the cinema, thinks that one reason Wilder's work holds up so well today is he's unsentimental, unlike a lot of classic Hollywood films. And he's unsentimental about women as well as men. And people sometimes mistake that for being misogynistic, but there are about 3 or 4 women in his films who are really rotten people, like Barbara Stanwyck and Dublin Downey is a psychopath. But there are a lot of women who you really admire in his films, strong women, and but they're very complex, just like the men in his films. And then I also I just want to I like to trace how somebody becomes who they are. And Wilder had this long apprenticeship as a journalist and screenwriter, and I was just interested too in seeing these films. As a selfish motive I have when I write a book is I want to see the early work and see how he developed. And I found some films in Germany and even in Hollywood in the earlier period that were mixed bags, but they had some wonderful things in them. But they taught me a lot about Wilder. I mean, just for the fact that he made a lot of musicals in his career. Who thinks of him as a director of musicals? But we could go into that. Germany, they had a lot of music and films. They put it in to entertain the masses, and he was kind of stuck with musical interludes and comedies. But some of the songs are good and some are not so good. And then in Hollywood, he was kind of typecast with the same kind of films until he did Ninotchka for Ernst Lubitsch, and that was his real big breakthrough.
But it's interesting because the 1940s really was a very dramatic year for Billy Wilder. I'm sorry, a very dramatic decade. It's not a decade filled with comedies. You do have The Major and the Minor. You do have A Foreign Affair, and I know The Emperor Waltz, which is not the favorite among a lot of Wilder followers, but there's some serious dramas there.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the late 50s and the 60s arrive, its comedy plays a very major part. And the Apartment is kind of in the middle because it walks this amazing line between drama and comedy that I can't think of many films that have done it as successfully.
Yeah, when I was giving Wilder that award, I had lunch with him and Jack Lemmon, and I said to Wilder, what do you think is your best film? And he said, The Apartment. And I said, why? And he said, because it's my best mixture of comedy and drama. And he said, that was the mixture I was trying to achieve my whole life. And it's a seamless mixture. It's beautifully integrated. The screenplay by him and Diamond is a classic. You can read it. It's available in print. But it's very daring because it pirouettes from farce to tragedy or near tragedy. For example, a key scene, Diamond mentioned this in an interview, when Jack Lemmon finds out that Shirley MacLaine has been having trysts with his boss in his apartment. He's devastated. He goes to a bar and gets drunk, and we saw the shot of Hope Holiday, who's wonderful in the film, and she's become a friend of mine. She's a good source for my book. It's very funny. They both get sloshed, and he takes her back to his apartment, and it's sort of farcical. And then he finds out that Shirley MacLaine is in his bed, as you showed people, and she's overdosed. But Hope Holiday's character doesn't understand what's going on, and so there's this kind of, on one side of the screen is this farcical thing, like Jack Lemmon is getting frantic and she doesn't know why, and you know, he's running next door to get help, and she thinks he's going for ice cubes, I think. And but it's Diamond said that the line was very thin between tragedy and comedy. He said if there was a laugh in the wrong place, it might have really hurt the film. And so they were holding their breath at the preview, and it worked. The audience got the the point. You know, they didn't laugh at the serious parts; they laughed at the funny parts. But Hope Holiday is being dragged out of the apartment by Jack Lemmon, and poor woman doesn't know what's going on. And she told me she lost one of her shoes, and she was being dragged across the linoleum floor, and then she's trying to hold on to her shoes, and she's being shoved out the door, and he's frantically trying to rescue Shirley MacLaine. So that's a great example, but it's very daring because most screenwriters would have been content just to show her overdosing and make it a straight drama. But Wilder gave an interview, some critics at the time didn't understand this picture because he was always breaking ground. American audiences back then were not very used to shifting tones like that. And I found a review by Bosley Crowther at the New York Times who was very clueless.
How unusual.
Notoriously clueless critic. He reviewed Truffaut's Shoot the Piano Player in 1962, and he couldn't understand the shifts of tones. You know, he said, sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's, you know, somebody gets shot and what's going on. Truffaut's gone haywire in this film. And Hollis Alpert on a Saturday Review wrote the most clueless review of The Apartment. And he didn't like the shifts of tones. He called the film a dirty fairy tale with a schnook hero and a sad little elevator operator as a princess. And Wilder was offended at first, but then he thought, oh, dirty fairy tale. Yeah, it is kind of a dirty fairy tale. He began to think that was good. But Alpert was so confused that he actually thought the film was endorsing Jack Lemmon lending out his apartment to his superiors for sex so he could get promoted. I mean, he totally misunderstood this film. And so some of the audience just didn't get it, but the film became a big hit. And to the credit of the American audience, they really appreciated it and they understood it. It helped advance our you know, our sophistication, and Wilder deserves a lot of credit for that, just as Lubitsch did earlier. That whole wave of European Jewish filmmakers who emigrated had a huge impact on American cinema because we were very Victorian still when Lubitsch came over. And Wilder, with his dark sense of humor, said Lubitsch was one of the talented ones who was called to Hollywood. He didn't have to flee like I did. And he made American cinema very sophisticated with his romantic comedies and musicals. And then Wilder comes along and breaking a lot of taboos and navigating the system very cleverly, both of them getting around censorship and pushing the envelope. But anyway, some critic at the time of The Apartment said to Wilder, the film was too sentimental. I guess he means it has a kind of a qualified happy ending. It's very realistic. But Wilder said, I made the film so as not to be sentimental. And then he made an extraordinary comment. He said, I don't consider The Apartment a comedy. I think it's a drama. And he said, I portray Americans as beasts. I mean, what a strong comment. When he lets his hair down, it's a very scathing indictment of sexual hypocrisy in the corporate mindset. And it's about two very regular people. We can all relate to these two working class people who are stuck in this corporate trap and the corruption, and they managed to get out of it through their basic decency. And that's kind of what the film is about.
Now, prior to The Apartment, a lot of Wilder's films, at least through the 50s after Ace in the Hole, were adaptations of some kind of a play, or there was some other source that inspired them, whereas The Apartment was an original script, was it not?
Yeah, well, you know, after he did Sunset Boulevard, which is one of his really great films, great film about Hollywood, he broke with Charles Brackett, his first major writing partner in America. They were having some ideological and other problems. From the very beginning, as Brackett's diaries revealed, there was friction between them. They're very different. Wilder was Eastern European Jewish, wisecracking former reporter, and Brackett was a blue blood WASP from Eastern United States, wealthy background. And he was anti-Semitic too, and the diaries sadly have numerous instances of this. And he didn't like Wilder's calling women on the phone at the office, and some of his harsh the arguments they had, and he carried a riding crop or a cane as he walked up and down as they worked in this irritated Brackett. And finally they broke up, but it reveals that they broke up over the House Committee on Un-American Activities hearings in 1947, that Brackett actually supported the hearings, and he said Dalton Trumbull should have been, compelled to testify. And Wilder, as an immigrant, really valued the freedoms of America, especially the First Amendment. And he said at one point in his life that he thought the Supreme Court was the most important thing about America. And now I wonder what he would think today. But he was he was against the blacklist. He was took a strong stand against it. They had very angry arguments. And Wilder said, "I don't want to work with you anymore." They still did Sunset Boulevard, I guess, because of inertia. They wanted to finish it. But Wilder said, "I want to have more freedom." So then he goes without Brackett and he makes Ace in the Hole, which is his darkest film. It's a very scathing,
Brilliant. Yeah.
great film about American journalism. This unscrupulous reporter played by Kirk Douglas who keeps a man trapped in a cave to build up a story, and the man dies. And it's very corrosive. And of course, the audience in America recognized that he was attacking them for being gullible and buying all these sensational stories. It did better in Europe, naturally, but he was kind of running for cover for a while, as you were implying. He was adapting plays, Stalag 17, 7-Year Itch, etc. Sabrina, interesting period, but not as good as the later period. But when he gets together with Diamond, it was a big shift for him, because he and Diamond were very simpatico. Diamond was Eastern European immigrant as well. He came from Romania. He came as a child, unlike Wilder, so Diamond didn't have an accent. I interviewed his son, Paul, who's a screenwriter, very helpful to me. And he said his dad, who I interviewed too on the set of the front page, he was more fluent in English than Wilder, although, as Paul said, nobody was wittier in English than Billy Wilder. But he always felt he needed a collaborator who could help him with his insecurities about the second language. And he also is so social. He didn't want to work in an office by himself. He liked talking it out and hashing it out. They'd spend weeks or months talking about the story before they would write a script. And Diamond would do the typing, and but it was all really close collaboration, and Diamond was involved in every step of the production. But what they did was, Wilder had an idea for a film in the late 40s. He had seen this is so typical of him. He saw Brief Encounter, the romantic film that David Lean directed from a Noel Coward play called Still Life. Came out in 1945. It's about a suburban married woman, Celia Johnson, who has an affair with a doctor played by Trevor Howard. It's a beautiful film, but rather solemn, and Wilder kind of kids it in a couple of his films, and it's very romantic. And they play Rachmaninoff music on the soundtrack, and he makes fun of that in 7-Year Itch when they have the fantasy scenes where Tom Ewell imagines he's seducing Marilyn Monroe, and the same music is playing. And but anyway, in that movie, Wilder said, "I became interested in this one character who's Trevor Howard's friend, who has an apartment that the adulterous couple is going to use for their sexual tryst." And he began thinking about this guy climbing into the bed that was all disheveled and still warm from the lovers' bodies, and emptying the ashtrays. Those scenes actually don't happen in Brief Encounter. He was rewriting it in his mind, because in the movie, they never make it into the bed because the guy comes home unexpectedly and they take off. But it planted an idea in his mind. And it's so typical of him to think of this peripheral character who's kind of like the prototype for Bud Baxter, the schnook who has to clean up the messes and everything. But he didn't really have a plot. And also, it wouldn't have been possible to do that film under the censorship in the late 40s. But in 1951, there was an incident that when Wilder directed Lemon and Some Like It Hot, he loved him so much, he thought, "I want to do another film with this guy. He's a genius." And he was sort of his everyman character. So he thought of this Brief Encounter nugget. And then they thought of what happened to Jennings Lang. Jennings Lang was an agent with MCA, talent agency in Hollywood, and he was having an affair with his client, Joan Bennett, the actress. And her husband was Walter Wanger, a distinguished producer. And Wanger shot Jennings Lang in the parking lot of MCA And the story that you always heard was that Jennings Lang was shot in the testicles and lost one of his testicles, and people made a lot of sick jokes about it. But I know his son, Rocky Lang, who's the writer director, and he wrote a memoir, and he said he heard from the kids at school his dad was shot in the balls, and he came home and asked his mother, was my dad shot in the balls? And she said, well, I'll talk to your father. And that night, his father came home and called his son up into his study and dropped his pants and pointed to a scar on his upper thigh and said, here's where I was hit. The guy was a poor shot, fortunately. But it makes a better story to say I was shot in the balls. It's just not true. And but that gave them the hook, because Jennings Lang was using the apartment of Jay Cantor, who was a minor agent at MCA, was loaning out his apartment to him for the tryst. Cantor later became a well-known producer and studio executive, and so that kind of, you know, he puts two ideas together and they come up with the apartment, and then they set it in modern New York, and they made the characters very ordinary people. But you know, that suggests a certain connection between the apartment and the pervasive corruption of Hollywood, which I think is I call it a criminal enterprise from top to bottom. When I came to Hollywood, I was in Wisconsin. I love Sunset Boulevard, but I thought it was maybe too dark a portrait of Hollywood, and I thought writers in Hollywood were complaining too much. And then I got to Hollywood, and I realized it was like a documentary. And I said that to Wilder, and he said, it's a Valentine. I love that. It's like, it could have been much worse the way he portrayed it. But when I moved there, I took an apartment very quickly because I was in a rush. And I found out I was about 3 blocks from the dump where Joe Gillis has his apartment in Sunset Boulevard, the hack screenwriter who's the patron of all screenwriters, patron saint of all screenwriters. And I was right up the road from the seedy hotel where Nathaniel West set a lot of Day of the Locust, the best Hollywood novel. But in Wilder's main metaphor for corruption in American capitalism is the insurance company gambling on people's life and death, you know. And in Double Indemnity, Fred McMurray is a corrupt insurance company agent who's trying to scam the company, and he has a insurance company guy in Ace in the Hole. And then so Jack Lemmon works for a big insurance company, Consolidated Life, and so it's kind of like that's another connection between that corporate culture and the soulless culture of Hollywood.
Without a doubt. And once again, those the settings, the Alexander Trauner settings, with the endless row of desks and the fluorescent lights, and I think there was some forced perspective to the set that they but that's so powerfully done to really set this setting for us about this whatever we describe the corporate ethics and the corporate atmosphere at the time.
Yeah, you know, there's a big influence from King Vidor's 1928 film, The Crowd, which is really a great film. As a producer friend of mine, when Jim Aubrey was gutting MGM in the 70s, ruining the studios, selling all their props and stuff, he threw out a lot of their old screenplays. And this producer friend of mine found a dumpster on the lot filled with silent film screenplays, and he took about 10 of them home, including The Crowd, which is the best film MGM ever made. You know, I mean, that shows you how little they valued their past. But anyway, The Crowd is a great film about an ordinary couple in New York in mid 1928, and it's famous for shots of this vast office with all these desks. And Orson Welles also imitated that in The Trial.
I was just going to say,
yeah, 1962. It is Kafka-esque. And Wilder on the last night of Wells on the last night of his life, being interviewed by Merv Griffin, referred to wonderful Billy Wilder, he said. So there's a connection among all those artists. And so they created this archetypal image of this vast office, and fluorescent lights. I used to work in offices with fluorescent lights. They really are hell on your eyes too. And you're right, they had forced perspective in the background, and they had little people sitting at desks, and then they even had some cutouts moving around. Trauner was widely considered the greatest of all art directors. He worked with Wells and other people, and Wilder numerous times, Kiss Me Stupid, Emerald Leduce, and Edward Boyle worked on it too, who was Hitchcock's art director. He worked on The Apartment. So it's a magnificent film. They shot most of it in Hollywood. They shot some New York scenes. It was so cold that they came back because it was so difficult to film. Like Jack Lemmon, there's a scene that's unforgettable where he's locked out of his apartment one night because some guy's carrying on with a woman, and Lemmon is sitting on this long bench and he's freezing and he's trying to sleep. It's really sad. And it was so cold they had to spray him with antifreeze when they were shooting the scene. And they finally said, let's go back to Hollywood. And Trotter built the exterior of Lemon's apartment on the Goldwyn lot, you know. But they had a few establishing shots of the restaurant and things in the office building in New York, etc.
I love black and white cinematography, but it never looks more depressing than in a Billy Wilder film of this era. Only these are expensive Hollywood productions, but there's a bleakness to the black and white, and it's a theme that continues to his. You know, I mean, I think of 1, 2, 3, Kiss Me Stupid, The Fortune Cookie. I'm fairly certain he would have continued working in black and white had the industry allowed directors to do that regularly. Any thoughts on the black and white nature of the apartment, the look of the film?
Yeah, a really great cinematographer shot the film, Joseph Lachelle, who isn't talked about very much, but he was one of the masters. He did Laura, he got an Academy Award for that, a great film noir. He did Lubitsch's last completed film, Clooney Brown. He did Irma La Douce, he did Kiss Me Stupid, which is a really bleak look at small town American life, but it's very elegantly shot. Wilder used the word elegant a lot when I talked to him about his style. He liked a rather unobtrusive style, but it's very beautifully choreographed, and the harmonious compositions and the camera movements are all very expert. And he used the widescreen really well, but he preferred black and white, as did a lot of important directors. It stylized the films and took away some of the gaudy colors. When you have color, it's hard to control the color because your eye kind of goes in different directions. And one way to control it is to take color out of the scenes, as some directors do, and make it less bright. But it suits the sort of pastel gaudiness of Irma La Douce. And in the later Wilder films, Sherlock Holmes and Avanti are very beautiful color films. And his style got more and more liberated as time went on, and he went outdoors more. He became more into nature, romantic nature photography, and Sherlock Holmes and Avanti uses the foreign settings very beautifully. He became kind of a European filmmaker again after Hollywood kind of lost interest in him. But Kiss Me Stupid is a great film, and I really advocate a lot for his post apartment films. And Kiss Me Stupid was so corrosive in its attack on American small town sexual hypocrisy that he and Diamond were virtually run out of town. The press outcried against it. And Diamond said he and Wilder just stared at each other for 6 months after that. They couldn't write. They said we were like a couple that just had a two-headed child and were afraid to have sexual intercourse. And then they did Fortune Cookie, which is not one of their better films. It's kind of watered down, trying to be nice to some extent, but still very bleak. Another film about an insurance scam. But then he really picked up his energies in the 70s and made some terrific films. Some of them, I mean, Fortune Front Page is a very dark of the very funny play by Hector MacArthur about journalism, which is a very harsh portrayal of journalism. But Wilder made it less funny because he made the reporters seem quite heinous in the film. And he had a lot of experience. He understood the crassness of the newspaper business. So it's kind of it's a cousin to Ace in the Hole, but it's done in color, and it has humor. But people said, well, it's not as funny as it could have been. Well, he didn't intend it to be that funny. You know, he was getting darker and darker as time went on. Fedora is a fascinating film. It has a serious casting problem. Mark Keller is just not, she's disastrously bad in the main role, but in a way it fits because she's playing somebody who's forced into being a double for her mother, who's a famous actress, and this poor young woman doesn't know how to act, and so Mark Keller is flailing around it. But it's a kind of a re-look at Sunset Boulevard from a even more jaundiced perspective, because Wilder and Diamond felt that they were kind of lost in the new Hollywood. It's kind of, they didn't understand. Wilder said, I go to see some of these movies like The Gauntlet, which is just cars crashing. And you can imagine what he would say about Michael Bay films, he said, I like certain films like American Graffiti, I like it, but he said, if I were to try to do a film like that, it would be phony because it's just not my thing. And he told me on the set of the front page, he said, it's like if you're a great composer of polkas, but nobody's dancing the polka anymore. What do you do? So he was a man kind of without a country in his later years.
And you do write some very compelling chapters on those later films. Your chapter on Fedora is very compelling, and of course on Avanti, which I agree with you, is very, very underrated, and probably I think the last truly successful in terms of a entire creation of a film that he did. I mean, I think an outstanding film. So The Apartment, would you agree that after The Apartment, the critical establishment, even though, as you indicated, they were not all that on board with the film, they sort of turned away or almost turned against Wilder in larger numbers after The Apartment?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3 came after that, and I know that film has a lot of fans. Excuse me, but I think it's overly broad. I mean, there's some very funny things in it. It's some very broad political satire, but it's about the divided Berlin, which is not a particularly funny subject. But he liked to make humor out of dark subjects. But one thing happened when the wall went up, and while they were making the film, and he had to rewrite the script to account for that, and so it seems a little anachronistic already by the time it came out. President Kennedy called Wilder to Peter Lawford's beach house while he was preparing 1, 2, 3, and he wanted to see the script of 1, 2, 3. He was worried about would it affect perception of the Berlin crisis, and Wilder, to his credit, refused to show the president the script, even though he was a liberal Democrat and admired Kennedy. That took a lot of guts for an immigrant filmmaker, but he didn't want any control over his film. And one of the German reviewers said, Billy Wilder laughs at what breaks our hearts, But then the film finally, back in the 80s and 90s, has been embraced by European filmmakers and audiences. They now can see the humor with distance. They say comedy is tragedy plus time. But I think it's overly broad, but that's just my perspective. And Irma Leduc's not one of his better films, but I think the audience was moving on. The sexual revolution was coming, and all kinds of turmoil in our society. And but the turning point was Kiss Me Stupid. Wilder and Diamond were shocked by the reception. They thought they were making a restoration comedy. And the play by Anna Bonacci is a terrific play. It's a feminist play, actually, and it does very well in Europe whenever it's performed. It's a classic. They did a stage production with Jean Moreau playing both roles. It was one of her first triumphs, and there was a film version with Gina Lollobrigida that's pretty good, but not as good as the Wilder film. But he set it in the contemporary world, whereas the play was set in the 1800s. And if it had been more stylized, the audience probably would have accepted it. And he also had Peter Sellers playing the man who's pathologically jealous. He's kind of like an Othello who is his own Iago. He's sort of insane. And Sellers had 8 heart attacks in 1 week when they were shooting the film and had to bow out. And I interviewed Fernando Trueba, who's a Spanish director who became a good friend of Wilder, and people will remember him at the Academy Awards. He got the Oscar for Belle Epoque, and he said, I would like to thank God, but I don't believe in God. I just believe in Billy Wilder. And I love that. And Wilder was mixing a martini when he heard that on TV, and he dropped the martini glass and the bottle, and his wife screamed. And the next day he called Trueba at his hotel. He said, Fernando, it's God. And they were good friends already, I found out, but I thought I better interview this guy. And he told me Wilder made some surprising comments. He said Trueba said, are there some films you wish you had made? He said, well, I'd rather tell you about 6 films I wish I hadn't made. And he listed 6 films that he didn't think succeeded. And but he said the best work I ever did was the 6 weeks that I shot with Peter Sellers on Kiss Me Stupid. That was really counterintuitive, because all the other reports are that they didn't get along, and Sellers, who loved to improvise, clashed with Wilder because Wilder and Diamond were very strict about not letting actors improvise. And I saw on the set of the front page, Diamond would sit on a little stool right off camera, and he had the right to interrupt the shooting and correct the actors if they changed the line or whatever, or that he would rewrite a line on the spot if they thought it was a little better. But according to Tereba, Wilder really got along with Sellers, and Sellers, with his charm, and he would have stylized the film more and made it more palatable to the audience. But I like Ray Walston because he's the real thing. He looks like a small town guy, unglamorous, venal, and he's such a nasty little fellow. I mean, that's why I like that film. Is corrosive. The only reviewer in America who liked that film at the time was Joan Didion, who reviewed it for Vogue magazine, and she said it shows in America we don't want to see the true country of despair, a place where dawn breaks and it's very depressing, and all the ice is melted in all the drinks, and it's shabby sexuality, etc. And Americans just didn't want to see themselves reflected in the screen. It's just like what happened with Ace in the Hole. And then after that, he kind of lost his audience, and he was free to be himself in a strange way.
Well, Joe, we could just go on and on. I know by now there are questions and comments that I know our audience would like to share with us. And I know Lori's going to assist with our taking questions and comments from the audience. Before we get to those, I just want to remind people that in a week from Wednesday, there will be another New Plaza Cinema online lecture that I will be giving it on the films that deal with the cinema justice issues, stories based on real legal cases, and it's called The Cinema Seeks Justice. And here's a little teaser for that. So we hope to see you there. And right now, Lori can assist us with taking questions and thoughts.
Hey, everyone. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I also wanted to tell everyone that we have people today from not only 26 states here in America, but 15 different countries, which is just so amazing. Because I remember when we started this whole thing online, and it was mostly Upper West Side New Yorkers, and now we have this like amazing online community. So thank you to all of you for hanging in there with us. We do have a question from Nina Sweet. Nina, could you unmute and start your video?
I just wanted to, let's see. Do you hear me?
We hear you perfectly.
I just wanted to comment on how Wilder helped to show the range of previously actors who were previously considered classic leading men, and sort of stuck in that leading man box. But I would think of an actor like William Holden, who was in that leading man category, but Wilder gave him showcases to show and expand his talents, especially in Sunset Boulevard and Stalag 17, where he doesn't play typical romantic leads as he always did previously. And also he gave Lemon, who was one of the great comic actors, the great comic role in Some Like It Hot, where Lemon really took off and showed enormous comic range. So these actors, it must have been a great gift to them, those roles, because it really showed them at full range. So I really appreciate Wilder for that, for us seeing these actors.
No, and especially with The Apartment, we see Lemon getting more of a chance to take on the dramatic side as well of his work. So we see his comic side, but also his skills as a dramatic actor. And Fred McMurray, who most of from my generation we know from television, from my three sons, he had been in some rather thankless roles over the years. This was probably the best role he had since Double Indemnity, and a very offbeat casting for McMurray here.
A real sleazy. And nobody ever.
A bit of an in-joke here. His character Sheldrake is the same name of the character from
Fred Clark's producer.
Thank you, Fred Clark's producer character from Sunset Boulevard, who won't give.
I knew that sounded familiar.
Yeah, I wonder where I wondered where Wilder got the name, because he uses it for a number of characters, and Wilder, like a lot of writers, borrowed names from sports figures. I did that when I was a screenwriter too. And Wilder was a super sports fan. And I looked up, there was a guy named Eddie Sheldrake, who was a guard on the UCLA basketball team in 1951. And that's where Sheldrake comes from. But McMurray, one of the fruits of my research, looking at early films Wilder wrote after he came to Hollywood in 34, in this period between 34 and 36, before he teamed with Brackett, he wrote some very, not very good films, but one was called Champagne Waltz. And it has the first appearance of what you would call a Billy Wilder character in an American film. McMurray plays a saxophone player who goes to Vienna, and his American jazz, which Wilder was a huge fan of American jazz, that's what brought him to Berlin, because he was a publicist for the American band leader Paul Whiteman, who he adored. But McMurray goes to Vienna, and he ruins a business next door, which is a classic Viennese waltz establishment with a woman who is a descendant of the Strauss family. And then he feels guilty about it, and he falls in love with her, and they go to New York, and they start a kind of combined jazz waltz nightclub, which is very bizarre. At the end, it doesn't quite work, but McMurray plays this wisecracking guy, gum-chewing guy called Buzzy Ballou, which is a great Billy Wilder character name. And you can see the embryonic Billy Wilder wise guy character, who a lot of his films deal with the conflict between impersonal sex and love. And that shows why he's a romantic director in many ways, that he thinks there's something missing when you have impersonal sex where people are exploited. I mean, the worst kind of example is McMurray exploiting Shirley MacLaine for sex in The Apartment and lying to her that he's going to dump his wife and marry her, and really heartless treatment of a woman. And then Jack Lemmon's character becomes a mensch, as his next door neighbor, Dr. Dreyfus, says, "Be a mensch." And as Ed Sickoff, who wrote a really good Wilder biography, said that the characters who are portrayed as the true New Yorkers are not Lemon and MacLaine, who come from other cities, but the Dr. Dreyfus and his wife and the landlady, who are Jewish. And Ed Sickoff says Jews are where the home is, the real values, the Hamish values. So when he says be a mensch, there aren't too many explicitly Jewish characters in Wilder films, but that guy is very important. Jack Kruschen got an Oscar nomination. And at the end of the film, when Lemon rebels against McMurray and turns back the key to the executive washroom, that's the big turning point. He says, "I decided to become a mensch." You know what that is? It's a human being. And that's kind of true of a lot of Wilder films. People are, even in Ace in the Hole, that Kirk Douglas is such a SOB in that film, but he starts feeling very guilty about what he did to this poor man, trapping him in the cave, and he lets himself be killed basically because he feels so guilty, and kind of redeems himself. And that theme keeps occurring in many Wilder films. But when you mentioned Lemon and Holden were his two favorite actors. Wilder was asked by Cameron Crowe in their interview book, which of your characters do you identify with the most? He said Sefton in Stalag 17, the Holden character. And Holden won his Oscar for that. He was he's a very wise guy, operator in this POW camp, and everybody hates him. Truffaut wrote a piece on that film when he was a young critic and said it's the story of an intelligent man surrounded by idiots, and that's why he liked the film. And so they all persecute this man because they think he's an informer in their midst, but he's not. But he's superior to all of them because he sees through all the lies and the bullshit and everything. And Wilder said, "Holden is me," he said at one point, and he certainly identifies with him in Sunset Boulevard, less so in Sabrina, plays a different kind of role, but he's very much related to him in Fedora, where he plays a down on his luck film producer. And I said, "Did you identify with this guy?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I could write 5 pictures about that guy dragging his ass up and down Hollywood Boulevard trying to get a film deal." You know, that's kind of how Wilder felt in the late 70s. But Lemon was his everyman character, the ordinary person. Lemon had an extraordinary range as a dramatic and comic actor. I think he was the best actor of that generation. I've been seeing a lot of Lemon films for fun and also catching up on ones I hadn't seen. And I'm just constantly impressed by his fabulous range that the man had. And he did some very ambitious theater roles, Long Day's Journey and Tonight, and he did a remake of 12 Angry Men. And he was a great actor. Henry Fonda, I think, was the best actor of the generation before that. But Wilder identified through Lemon with ordinary people. And The Apartment is very much like People on Sunday, which is a very good German film that Wilder wrote. It's a late silent film about ordinary folks going on a weekend jaunt to the Wannsee district of Berlin, which was kind of a lake resort. And it's shadowed by our awareness of the Holocaust, because that's where the Wannsee conference was held, where they planned the Holocaust in 1942. But in this film, it's this place where these working people have 1 day a week off, and they get to have this kind of rushed, not a vacation, but a little break. And it's a very bittersweet film because it's about a young girl who's seduced by this cad. And then again, it's somebody you really like, this young woman who is has a warm heart, but she's trampled on by this guy, and he's a gigolo character, as Wilder was in his youth. He worked for a while as a Eintanzer, which means tea dancer, at a couple of Berlin hotels. He wrote his best journalism is a 4-part piece about how he worked as a tea dancer at hotels, dancing with women for tips, elderly women, young women, different women. It could make a terrific film. And it's in a book that Noah Eisenberg edited recently of Wilder's journalism. And there are 2 books of his journalism in German. And that piece is great. But a lot of Wilder's characters are either prostitutes or gigolos or compromised in that sense. And then they're forced to become more authentic and more empathetic with people. That's a theme he returns to.
Hold Back the Dawn uses a gigolo character.
That's a great film. Yeah,
and thanks to your book, it's now available. And thanks to your book, I realized what a terrific film it is, because Wilder always belittled Hold Back the Dawn, which was a very autobiographical screenplay in many ways that he didn't direct, but it's a wonderful film with Charles.
Yeah, it actually, my book didn't bring it back, but fortuitously it came out on Blu-ray. For a long time, it was hard to get, oddly enough, even though it was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, and Olivia de Havilland gives a great performance as a very guileless California school teacher who, on a trip to Tijuana, meets a unscrupulous Romanian gigolo played by Charles Bray, who's desperate to get into the U.S. And it's a very timely film because it deals with immigration and xenophobia and things. But it's based on Wilder's experiences trying to get into America. He had to go to Mexico after he got a visa for 6 months to work at Columbia. He had to go to Mexico to re-enter. And he had to persuade a consular official to let him stay in the US. And you could have stayed for years down there and been trapped. And that's what the film is about. And I found out this man's name was Willis Myers. And Myers said, do you have papers to prove that you're not a criminal or whatever? And Wilder said, well, if I went back to Germany to get papers, they put me in Dachau. I don't have any papers. And so the guy kind of thought about it, and he said, what do you do? He said, well, I'm a writer. And he thought about it a little more, and he stamped the thing. He said, write some good ones. And
Wow.
Wilder said when he got the Thalberg Award, he said, I've always tried very hard not to disappoint that dear man in Mexicali. That's Willis Myers. I found out he was an amateur magician. He was a part of the family of show business. I think that's one
That's
reason.
powerful
Yeah,
story.
yeah, that guy is, he's the unsung hero. I did, if anybody's interested, my chapter on Hold Back the Dawn is, I put that on the film magazine Bright Lights, which is an online magazine for free. And I found some documents that are interesting, Wilder's immigration papers and things like that. But that's his most autobiographical film. And a lot of people didn't think about that because he didn't direct it. Mitchell Lyson did a good job of directing it, but he cut a scene in which Charles Boyer is despondent and he sees a cockroach crawling along the wall of his hotel room. And he addresses the cockroach as if it's himself. And he says, you know, who cares about you? You don't belong in any country. And Boyer and Lyson didn't like the scene, so they cut it. And Wilder was so angry that he and Brackett went back to the office and said, if the son of a bitch won't talk to a cockroach, he's not going to talk to anybody in the rest of the picture. So they cut out almost all his dialogue, which at first I thought maybe that's kind of sabotaging the film, but actually it works because the guy becomes progressively more chastened about his guilt for exploiting this very kind, naive school teacher, and he doesn't say much, and he's reticent, and that makes his character more interesting. But it made Wilder want to direct again in America, and that's what impelled him to direct.
Well, we have another question here. AR. Also, just so everyone knows, if you go to your reaction button, you can raise your hand from there. So it's all you. Unmute.
Yes, thank
start
you.
your video.
I wonder about Wilder's Judaism and his lack of Jewish characters. What do you know of his feelings about writing Jewish characters? Was he trying to suppress or repress his own Judaism? Was he didn't want to get into the politics of it too much? What are your thoughts on that?
Part of it was in American films in the 30s and 40s, they were kind of anxious about portraying Jewish characters on screen. A lot of the moguls were Jewish, but they were worried about the European market, and they shamefully didn't want to antagonize Germany. And you know, like the word Jew was taboo on American screens pretty much, excuse me, until Gentleman's Agreement in 1947, after the war and after the Holocaust. But Lubitsch, when he made To Be or Not to Be, which is a very strong anti-Hitler film, he couldn't use the word Jew when they one of the characters does Shylock's speech from Merchant of Venice, hath not a Jew eyes. They changed it to have we not eyes. So even he couldn't use the word, but Chaplin used it in The Great Dictator, lampooning Hitler. But Chaplin owned United Artists, so he could do what he wanted. But Wilder, I think, was just used to, he was very trying to blend into America like a lot of immigrants try to become very American. He was always an Americanophile, I guess is the word. In Europe, he liked American culture. And he was devout in his own way. He didn't make a big deal of it, but at the top of his scripts, he would type the initials CD, which means cum Deo, with God. And I was struck by the fact when Robert Kennedy was shot, Wilder went to a synagogue a couple blocks from his house and spent the whole day praying in there. He didn't make a big thing of it. He didn't talk about it very much, but yeah, he didn't have very many explicitly Jewish characters in his work, but he was a victim. His family were victims of the Holocaust, and I go into this in the book. It really marked him. His mother, stepfather, and grandmother were killed by the Nazis, and he was very aware of anti-Semitism. He said Vienna was worse than Berlin even, and he was mistreated for being Jewish and for being Polish, and he you know, gravitated toward defending outsiders, and you know, they had all those clashes with Brackett and other people, but he wanted to do Schindler's List as his final film. He said, as a tribute to my family who died in Auschwitz, is the way he put it. He didn't actually know that his mother did not die in Auschwitz. She died at the Plaszow camp And if you've seen Schindler's List, that's the camp that's run by the psychopathic Nazi played by Ralph Fiennes. And his mother was in the Krakow ghetto liquidation scene that's the centerpiece of that film. And she was put in the camp and died. And then his grandmother was killed elsewhere in Poland, and his stepfather was killed somewhere else. But one of the key moments for Wilder in 1935, after he had been in Hollywood for about a year, he saved up some money and went to Vienna. And as a newspaperman who was very hip about politics, he knew that it was very dangerous to be in Europe, and he desperately tried to get his mother and stepfather to leave, and they wouldn't leave. They didn't see the threat of Hitler as being as serious as Wilder did. Although Wilder said we didn't know how bad it was going to be, but he couldn't get them to leave, and then they died, and he was in Hollywood, and he felt very guilty for not being there to save them, and he went back to Germany. At the end of the war, he worked for the American Army in the denazification effort, which fizzled out because it turned out we were working with a lot of ex-Nazis and intelligence and other operations, and we didn't really denazify the country very much. And Wilder, but he was trying to find out where his mother was. Anyway, when Schindler's List came out, Wilder was interested in filming the book by Thomas Keneally, but Sid Sheinberg bought it for Spielberg at Universal. And Spielberg wasn't ready to make it. He kept thinking, I need to be more mature and tackle this difficult subject. And Wilder called him a few times and said, I'll direct it and you can produce it, or vice versa. And Spielberg kept hesitating. Finally, in the early 90s, Wilder thought, well, I want to make this as my final film. And he called Spielberg, and Spielberg had to tell him, I'm in pre-production with this film. It's about to start shooting soon. And Spielberg said it was the most difficult phone call of my life. And he said Wilder took it very graciously. And then he went to see Schindler's List. He saw it 3 times. He was overwhelmed by it. He thought it was the greatest film he ever saw. And he wrote a review for he chose a magazine in Bavaria, which is where the Nazis came from. He chose that carefully rather than a Berlin publication. And he said there were, people crying all over the theater, but he said, he talked about Holocaust deniers, and he said, I have one question for Holocaust deniers. Where is my mother? That's how he ends that powerful piece. It's kind of like a Billy Wilder story. You can imagine it because it's about a guy who's a kind of corrupt figure who pulls off a big scam and becomes a mensch. He's saving these Jews from the Holocaust. He has to scam the Nazi guy who's very corrupt and buy him off. It would work as a Billy Wilder film, but I think, frankly, Wilder was too old at that time to make that very demanding film. It was hard on Spielberg, who was a lot younger. The cold and the difficult conditions and the relatively short shooting schedule, Wilder might not have been up to making it at that time, but it meant a lot to him.
Someone wanted to know if you could make a comment or speak about I'm sorry.
Edie Adams. Oh,
in the movie.
Yeah,
I'm the chairman of the Edie Adams fan club, but I'm going to let Joe take it from here.
Yeah, I liked her when I was a kid. I liked her husband. Ernie Kovacs was one of the great geniuses of television. Edie Adams was very sexy and appealing. She had these cigar commercials where she would come on and smoke cigars in a sexy way. And Wilder was a friend of theirs. And actually, sadly, when Ernie Kovacs died in a car crash in 1962, it was across the street from Wilder's apartment. Wilder, his wife, Audrey, and he lived in an apartment on Wilshire Boulevard. And they had a party, and Ernie Kovacs went off and died. And but Edie Adams was his widow. But he had put her in the apartment. She plays the rejected former paramour of Fred McMurray, who is his secretary now, and she's bitter, and she spills the beans to Shirley MacLaine. And that leads to the great scene that Max was showing us with The Compact, which is a great piece of filmmaking. As Wilder said, we didn't want somebody to tell Jack Lemmon, verbally that, his girlfriend is having this thing with McMurray. We wanted to figure out a way to show it. It's a Lubitsch touch, a visual piece.
It's also so cinematic, that's, it's again, show me, the key also, the thought of, the key to success, the key to his apartment is his key to success. And, it's just so metaphorical and just played with so much. And it's just great.
It harks back to his German expressionism, because German expressionism, which he came out of to some extent, although when he came along, they were in their new objectivity period where they were dealing with people on the street, but expressionism with the extravagant sets, and it was not only cinematic but theater and literature, etc., and art. It was about expressing the inner life through the external, and so the compact is how she feels and how he feels, shattered, literally. And Lubitsch, one of his rules that he told Billy Wilder was, Wilder said most directors, they tell you 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 = 4, 2 + 2 = 4, etc. But he said Lubitsch would just say 2 + 2 and let you add it up. And he said, Lubitsch told him, if you let the audience add it up, they'll love you for it because it flatters our intelligence. Lubitsch gave a lot of clues like that and suggested things, and we put it together in our minds. And one of the censors said of Lubitsch, we know what he's saying, but we can't figure out how he's saying it, so we can't censor it, So he got away with murder. He implied all kinds of sexual things, but we knew. And Lubitsch said even, an idiot could understand the Lubitsch touch, although it actually, it's sophisticated at the same time. But that scene is a little different because then she says, it shows the way I feel. That's how I feel. And so it verbalizes the meaning of it, which you would think in a way is against what Lubitsch was saying, just show it, don't tell it. But Brackett once said that Wilder had this terrible anxiety that people wouldn't understand him, and he wanted to be clear. He's very clear. When I started writing my book, I thought, well, how do you write about this guy? His films are very clear, but actually there are a lot of subtext in his films. I found the deeper you get into them, they're very clear on the surface. You understand exactly what they're about, but there's so much going on underneath it. And I think what he's doing there is he's recognizing that she understands her shattered nature, and she's going to admit this. And they're both very self-aware characters, and that's part of the plot. So it's good that she tells him how she feels, but it's a shattering moment for him, and it's his image that's shattered, not hers. And he's living a kind of a myth, and a kind of, that's the fairy tale aspect. But it winds up, as Wilder said, the third act is as romantic as any Capra film third act.
Someone had asked about the recurring song in the theme song, and through your book, Joe, you identified it as Charles Williams' "Jealous Lover," which was from a 1949 film, The Romantic Age. I thought that piece of music was written for The Apartment, but apparently not.
Yeah, I thought that for a long time too. And Adolf Deutsch gets the music credit, but the song became a hit. It was called "Theme from the Apartment." But Wilder was a maven of pop music, and he uses pop music in his films really well. And all through his work, like Tangerine and Double Indemnity captures that bittersweet, dark mood. Noel Coward once said, it's amazing how potent cheap music is. I think that's a wonderful phrase. But Wilder remembered this tune, and he kept humming it for the UA music department until somebody recognized it, and they said, oh, it's from this British film, and so they got the rights to use it. And then John Williams played it on the piano in the film, and he dubbed the piano. The guy in the Chinese restaurant is playing the song that's their theme song in The Apartment. But I don't know why Charles Williams doesn't get credit. It's one of those things where he should have gotten credit, I think, right? But Adolf Deutsch gets all the credit.
Well, Joe, this has been a magical experience having you with us. I can only close by quoting C.C. Baxter: "Your tops, decency-wise and otherwise-wise."
Well, thank you for having me on. This has been a real pleasure.
I second that.
You're so good.
Please come back. We'd love to do this again sometime. And I just thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. Now we're going to turn things over to Sean, our marketing maven for New Plaza.
Thank you, everybody, by the way, who came to the show. That's really wonderful that everybody came, and it was
Wonderful.
really fun talking to you all.
Thank you so much, Mr. McBride. Joe, thank you. I sure hate to be the one to come on now because how do you follow that? But I do want to thank everyone today. It was really a great discussion, and what great energy in the chat. It was just all around a great day for us. I want to remind everyone that May 4th, Max is doing The Cinema Seeks Justice, and then May 8th, again, in honor of Holocaust remembrance, we're going to be talking about the 2017 film 1945. And so we hope that you all will join us for that. You can find out information about all of our virtual as well as our in-person films at newplazacinema.org. Please check those out. We've got several great discussions coming up, as well as great films that we're showing in New York. So if you're ever in Manhattan, please do stop by and say hi, and when you come, and check us out. We really look forward to seeing you. And again, thanks guys. It was just a fabulous discussion today.
Thank you.
And just
Thank
before,
you, Joseph. Thank you, everybody. Laurie,
if
Sean.
anybody would like to take a screenshot one more time of all of Joseph's books that he's recently put out. Needless to say, he's been very prolific during COVID. So please go to Amazon.com or a local bookstore, perhaps, and support a local artist. Local being the internet these days. Thank
Right.
you all. Have a
Thanks.
great Sunday.
Thank you. See you guys. Take care.
Take care, Joe.
Take care, Max, and everybody else. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you.